Hello friends, welcome to today's video. Today I'm going to be doing July reading wrap-up. I feel like I had a really successful reading month. I read a total of 7 books in the month of July, which I'm very happy about. And also I found some new favorites. I have, I think, 2 5 stars, a couple of 4 stars, and quite a few different genres in this pile, which is very exciting. So let's jump right into the video. I started off the month by finishing The Echo Wife by Sarah Gailey. This is a sci-fi book and I gave it 4.5 stars. I personally really enjoyed it. In the story, you are following a scientist who essentially made cloning possible. She developed all of the technology and cloning is just now part of day-to-day life. However, she has an ex-husband and he's an ex-husband because he left her for the clone of her, but like an improved version of her in his eyes. And then one day that clone knocks on her door because the ex-husband is dead. This book is so messed up. It has a very eerie, weird kind of tone, but I personally really liked it. I love the fact that it's not even morally gray. It's like everything about this book, everything that these characters, all of them, everything that they do is so extremely questionable. But I really enjoyed how messed up this whole world is and the premise of this book is. I personally had a really great time reading this book. I really like this type of haunting stories that make you feel a bit uncomfortable, but then not too explicit. There's nothing, I mean, there are like a couple of scenes that are a little gory, but as someone who is very sensitive to gore, I felt like there was decent like time and place for those moments in this book. I just really loved the overall tone of this book. It was pretty atmospheric, and the only reason why I gave it 4.5 stars rather than 5 stars is because I didn't quite like the ending. It felt a little bit too optimistic, too lighthearted for all of the events that happened throughout this book. But personally, I really loved it. I was a little bit nervous going into this book because the reviews for it aren't that great, but I personally had a great time reading this book. I enjoyed it a lot. It is a pretty short read, but I do highly recommend it, and I'm definitely going to be reading more by this author. After that, I filmed my video where a TBR jar picked my reads, and it was really fun to just randomly pick books from my physical TBR that probably have been there for way too long. But basically my focus in July, and it continues to be my focus in August, is reducing my physical TBR. So that was a very good way to do that. And the TBR jar pick that I read Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is a fantasy, the first book of the fantasy trilogy. It is called Between Earth and Sky trilogy, I believe. This book is inspired by pre-Columbian Americas. It is following like a multitude of different characters. So you have one character, Narampa, who is a sun priest. She is dealing with a lot of undermining, and people whom she is working with in the priesthood, they're basically doing things against her and they want to take her down from her position. Then you follow Shiala, who is a captain of a ship, and she's tasked to deliver a certain person to the city where Narampa is, the city of Tova. I believe it is like the capital of this world. However, she has to do that by going across the sea, which people don't normally do, and it proves to be a very dangerous path. And the person that she needs to deliver to the city of Tova is the third POV, Serapio. And Serapio from a very young age was told by his mother that he is to become a god. She performed some rituals on him when he was younger, so he's going to the city of Tova to fulfill his destiny. I gave this book 3.75 stars. I thought the concept of it was very interesting, and also I really loved the setting. I love the idea of it being inspired by pre-Columbian Americas. There are quite a few very interesting references, and in general this world in theory sounded very fascinating. However, the more I was reading this book, the more I felt like I didn't really feel that much emotional connection to any of the characters, and it almost felt like this world wasn't fully developed for my liking. I really wanted to have more world building. I wanted to have more detail. I wanted to be more immersed in this world, but most of the time things were just happening without real explanation, and also you don't really have enough time to develop emotional connections to all of the characters. I definitely felt for some of them, but not all of them. But in general, I just feel a bit of detachment from this book because in theory it sounded really good. So unfortunately this didn't quite work for me. I really thought that I was going to give this book much higher rating from the things that I heard about it, but unfortunately, yeah, it was a 3.75. It was still pretty entertaining. I think I'm going to be continuing this series. I'm not 100% sure on it yet, just because of the way that I felt about the first book, but I think I might, to see what happens, and maybe going further into the series will help me to form more attachment to this world and hopefully get more engaged with it as well. However, the next book that the TBR jar picked was also the first book in the fantasy series, but that was definitely a hit compared to Black Sun, and that was The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. I have been meaning to read this book for so long. I have heard so many things about this series, but also I have heard things that kind of intimidated me and scared me to go into this world, because I knew that this fantasy is pretty grim and dark, and so I was a little bit worried whether I'm going to like it or not. But I did. I gave this book 5 stars. I absolutely love this story. So in this world, there are people who possess magic power that are called aura genes, and they are able to essentially like feel all the earthquakes within the earth. They have some sort of connection with land, and they're able to not only feel any kind of shakes, but also they're actually able to cause them as well, which makes them extremely powerful. And so people who do not have this power, they are very scared of them, because that is essentially a power to destroy the entire world if they wanted to. And so over the years, people who possess this magic, they have been looked down upon, and most of them are pretty much being enslaved. So people who have magic power in this world, they either have a choice to go to this government establishment that essentially teaches them how to control their power, and then they have to work for the government, but they never fully have their freedom. They are constantly being told what they have to do, and they kind of serve for a lifetime to the government. And then there are also people who have this magic who just run wild, and some communities accept them if they don't know that they have these magic powers, but essentially they have a fate of being on the run for the rest of their life. You follow multiple POVs in the story. You have Essen, who is a mother who just lost her son. So her husband killed her son at the beginning of this book because he found out that the son possesses magic. Essen also has a daughter, but she doesn't know if the daughter is alive or dead because the husband since then left the city, so she has no idea if he left with his daughter or if the daughter is dead as well. And besides that, you have other POVs. You have a young girl, Damaya, who is being taken to this government establishment because her parents wanted to sell her to the government essentially. And then you also follow Cyanide, who is an origin who is being sent on a mission with a different origin who is a lot more powerful than her, and together they start to uncover some of the secrets that happen in this world, because not everything is quite as straightforward as everyone thinks. I personally really love this book. First of all, it has a very unique writing style that for me worked really well. It definitely takes some time getting used to, but I thought it was beautiful. Part of the reason why this writing style is so unique is because one of the POVs is actually written in second person, which makes it a very unique type of narration. And the way the story is crafted overall, not only language-wise, but also the way you are given puzzles of information about this world that you put together, and at the end the reveal is so good. This has such a good plot twist, and once you start discovering more pieces of information about this world and about the magic system, getting to the conclusion of this first book is so extremely satisfying. There are still so many questions that I have. This is a trilogy, so there's quite a lot that's going to happen in books 2 and 3, and I'm very interested to uncover all of the other secrets of this world. But this book, even on its own, is so incredibly satisfying and interesting, and I just absolutely loved my time reading this book. Also, as I said, I was pretty intimidated by it because I've heard that it's really dark. This book literally starts with a woman losing her child being killed by her own husband. So it is a very grim premise. But I think because this book starts with such a tragic event, but then it maintains its tone throughout the entire book, you don't really have things just for the shock value in this book. Everything is pretty dark and depressing. However, it also makes sense for this world. And that's why I felt like this book wasn't necessarily depressing for me personally. I felt very sad for all of these characters, and a lot of the things that happened here were terrible, but it didn't personally affect me, and I think that's why it really worked for me. It was pretty honest and straightforward about the things that happen in this world from very early on. So for me, it really worked. I cannot wait to continue this series. It's just such an interesting, it's a mix of fantasy and sci-fi, which also I don't really read that much of, even though I really love both of those genres separately, but I haven't really read many books that mix the two. I found it very fascinating. It was so satisfying to get to the ending of this book, and find out all of the plot twists. It was really great. So if you're looking for a new fantasy trilogy that is darker but also is fascinating at the same time, I would highly recommend this trilogy, even though I have only read book 1 of this series yet, but I personally thought it was a beautiful work of art and I cannot wait to continue this series. One of the coolest things that happened to me in July was the fact that I found an author that convinced me that I love romance books, and I found an author that I think is going to turn me into a romance reader, and that is Miss Abby Jimenez. Now, if you have been on this channel for any time, you might have heard me say that I'm not typically a romance reader. I can enjoy a romance once in a while for sure. It is just not the genre that I seek out very often, but I think Abby Jimenez is going to convince me otherwise, because I read 2 books by her this month and I loved both of them so much. The first book that I read was Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. So this is the first book out of the Part of Your World trilogy. I love this book. I gave it 4.5 stars. It is such a feel-good romance. It was fantastic. So in this book, you're following Alexis and Daniel. Alexis is a very successful doctor. She works in a hospital, and one day she had to drive to some family function, and then she gets stuck in the road somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and then this guy in a truck helps her to take her car out of the pit, and then later they see each other in a bar in a small town nearby, and it turns out that Daniel actually lives in the small town, and then they end up having a one-night stand. They have great chemistry together. However, they live 2 hours away from each other, and it is very much, you know, the typical romance trope of him being very rich and then she comes from like small town. It's the same, but it's reversed. Also, it is an age gap romance. However, she's the one who's older. I think Alexis is 36, 37, I want to say, in this book. And then he is 10 years younger than her. For me personally, this romance worked so well. The first like 30, 40, 50% of this book, I was convinced that it was going to be not even a 5-star. It was going to be a 6-star book, because I was absolutely obsessed with their chemistry. It was so funny. It was so funny that I had to read out loud many like parts to my boyfriend, and we would both giggle at them, because there were just so many moments that made it incredible. It was so entertaining and genuinely funny. I very rarely feel like I actually laugh at something that I read, but this book, it was funny at the beginning. And then, of course, it also goes into some more serious topics. It also gets deeper at times. Alexis has a lot of things that she has to deal with. She has very complicated and very negative relationship with her parents. And also she has an ex who is a chief surgeon of this hospital, and he cheated on her. So they broke up. However, her parents really love him, and it's just an awful, awful dynamic. So her going to see Daniel in the small town is her escape from reality to this beautiful world of this small town where everyone is nice and there's just so many good things happening. Not only good though, there are also problems in Wakan as well. But obviously being so far away from each other, having such different lifestyles, and then also an age gap also creates problems, so they're not sure if they should be together or not. I think this book hits so many things that I really, really loved. I actually didn't mind the age gap at all, especially considering the main female character was the one older. I also really loved both of these main characters. I feel like Alexis might not be a female character that everyone might enjoy, because she's a doctor, but then she is so smart in her job, in the things that she does. She's incredible, but at the same time she's so bad at anything that has to do with just basic life, because she was never taught the skills of like, she doesn't know how to clean, how to cook. She comes from family that is very wealthy, so she never really had to do any of those things. So she's very clueless in some ways, and then very, very, very smart and incredible in others. I personally really liked her. I felt like she reminded me of someone that I know in my life, and that just made my connection to her so much stronger, and I loved her and understood her as a character so much more. And then Daniel is just incredible. Daniel just might be my new favorite male character in a romance book. Like, Daniel is really hot. He's amazing. I absolutely loved everything about him. There was not a single flaw, nothing about him that I did not enjoy. And so their romance as well, I loved so much. I loved all of the things that they brought out from each other. I really loved how they both became better people by being with each other. As for the reason why I didn't give this book 5 stars, one is that there were a couple of scenes that were borderline magical realism, because there is this saying that the small town of Akan, it only keeps people that it likes, and then people who are bad for it, it kind of froze out. And so there were a couple of moments. It has things to do with like weather. All of a sudden there was like pouring rain and thunder and things like that that lean very strongly towards magical realism that I personally didn't quite love. It felt like it didn't really belong into the story. Also, I thought the book slowed down quite a bit towards like second half and then the ending. I enjoyed how things wrapped up at the very end, but getting there I didn't quite enjoy that. Overall, it was just not quite a 5-star, but I did really love it. I just think Abby Jimenez is amazing at writing romance, and I personally just really connected to the story. I enjoyed the story. I was so entertained and it was so fun to read it. So if you're looking for a new romance, I highly recommend checking this one out. It's just a really fun, entertaining time, and I would suggest giving it a chance if it sounds like something you might enjoy. I'm going to be going slightly out of order, but the next book I want to talk about is also by Abby Jimenez, because the second I finished Part of Your World, I knew that I really want to continue this trilogy. So I read book 2, Yours Truly. This book has much lower rating than Part of Your World, and I have read so many reviews on Goodreads of this book. It feels like most people think this is the worst book out of the trilogy. Personally, I gave it 5 stars. I really loved it. However, I absolutely 100% see why one might not enjoy this book. I understand the bad reviews completely. It's just that for me, I just felt differently about the story, so I personally really enjoyed it. So in the story, you're following Bree, who is the best friend of Alexis from Part of Your World. You do not need to read this book as a trilogy. You can read them. I think it's pretty much common for all romances that they're interconnected, but you don't actually need to read any of the books in order to understand book 2, book 3 of the series. In this book, you're following Bree, who is the best friend of Alexis. She also works in the same hospital in AR, and she just gone through a terrible divorce. And besides that, she has a brother who is very ill, and he is actually looking for a donor of a kidney. So she's just going through it. She has so much stuff going on in her life, and she's pretty much in a survival mode. And one day there is this new doctor that joins the hospital, Jacob, and he comes across so extremely arrogant and rude, and it feels like he's just there to ruin the only thing that Bree has that is good, which is her work. But we have a dual POV in this book, and we also follow Jacob, who also recently gone through a breakup, and then his ex is now dating his brother, which is also questionable. But he changes hospitals, and he has severe anxiety issues, and he deals with that on a daily basis. It is explored in so much detail here in this book, which I feel like if you never had anxiety, maybe it gives a good insight of what that is. But also, if you have had anxiety to any extent, you could relate to so many things that are in this book, because anxiety plays a really big role in the narration and in the way that Jacob is and how he behaves and so on. And so yeah, they start working together, and then at first they're pretty much I wouldn't say it's enemies to lovers, no, but the first impressions are terrible. However, some things happen that they start talking, and then they start becoming friends, and then there's actually fake dating trope, which is really fun, and I enjoy it a lot. My personal opinion is that the reason why people really dislike this book is because of its miscommunication. There is a lot of it. And don't get me wrong, I don't enjoy miscommunication whatsoever. It's not a fun trope to read at all. And there is also a lot of back and forth. The second these characters are close to telling each other about their feelings and finally being together and letting themselves be happy, they just pull back, and then they get close again and pull back, and so on. So I think this back and forth dynamic and also the miscommunication are the reasons why the reviews of this book are that bad. But for me personally, as much as it was so frustrating, don't get me wrong, I was really mad at this book. book at some points. But once I got to the end, I realized that if I were in the same situation, I would have probably felt exactly the same way. All of this back and forth, all of this hot and cold relationship, it all also made sense. There were definitely moments when they could have communicated more, and I mainly mean like the middle part of this book when they were fake dating. They could have communicated a lot more and it would have been so much clearer of how they feel about each other. But the miscommunication towards the end and kind of like the third act breakup in this particular story made so much sense to me, because as much as it was frustrating, I also thought about Brie and everything, all of the hardships that she has gone through in however much time passed before she met Jacob. I realized that it just makes sense. It makes sense the way that she felt. And the more I was thinking about it, the more I felt such strong emotional attachment to her, but also to Jacob, because I also could relate to so many things that Jacob was doing or the way that he was feeling. And I love them together. At the very end of this book, I cried my eyes out. I cried like a baby. I sobbed. It was heartbreaking, but in a happy way. This book was so good. Even though it was very frustrating to read at times, I also enjoyed it, and I was an emotional wreck after this book, but in a good way, because I was really happy how things got resolved. It obviously has a happy ending, of course, all romances do. But I really enjoyed this book. I connected to it. I gave it 5 stars. And I think in general, Abby Jimenez just writes amazing, amazing romance that is actually adult. I don't mean the level of spice. I mean the maturity and the experiences of the characters. And I'm just so happy that I gave her books a chance, because the 2 that I've read in this past month I absolutely loved. So I'm definitely going to be continuing this series, but also I really want to read all of her books now, because her romances just really work for me. The next book that I read was actually a pretty big disappointment, unfortunately. This book was The Stars Too Fondly by Emily Hamilton. I give this book 1.5 stars. It is a very low rating. Usually I would DNF books that I would consider to be a 1 star. In this case, I finished it, but it was just not a book for me at all. And also I thought it had a few general issues as well. So yeah, unfortunately it didn't work for me at all, although it sounded by the premise as something right up my alley, because it is about 4 friends who essentially steal a spaceship accidentally. So they mean to discover this mystery that happened on a spaceship 40 years ago. It was meant to go on a distant planet to establish humanity on this planet. However, on the day of the launch, the entire crew disappeared. Like, they just disappeared into the thin air and no one knew what happened to them. And so these 4 friends really want to uncover the mystery, and they sneak into the spaceship, but accidentally they engage it and it starts launching, and they are being launched into space to this planet without a way to return. Unfortunately, there were many things in this book that I thought were problematic. However, I want to point out a thing that I really enjoyed, and that is the representation of this book. This is a sapphic romance, and also you have a range of different characters in this book. You have one person who is bisexual, you also have a non-binary character, and so I really enjoyed seeing the range of different characters. However, unfortunately, that is literally the only thing that I enjoyed about this book, this and the premise. But I think the premise was just not executed really well. I think one of the main problems of this book is that it positions itself as an adult romance sci-fi, and there are definitely a couple of sex scenes in this book. However, the rest of the writing feels so YA, it almost actually feels middle grade. So many of these characters read like children. They are supposed to be 27, 28, but they behave like 5-year-olds, seriously. There were a couple of moments in this book when characters would have an argument and one of the characters would stick their tongue out because they're mad at the other person. And I'm like, have you ever seen a 27-year-old do that? Because personally, I've only seen 7-year-olds stick their tongue out during an argument because they don't like something. It was just one example of many, many instances when these characters, they truly read, they don't even read like teenagers, they read like children. But this is supposed to be adult. Another thing that I really didn't like, unfortunately, is the fact that this book is positioned as sci-fi. However, the science part of it is so wacky. And I am not a scientist. I don't know anything about anything basically, but still, like, I think authors' role in sci-fi is to convince the reader of the science. It doesn't mean it necessarily will check out in real life, but you need to make sure that you can convince that it could work. In this case, the author is not trying to convince anyone of anything. And even when we're talking about the creation of this spaceship and the way that its engine was made, literally every other page there is a sentence that says, nobody knew what they were doing. They picked the best scientists in NASA and they still didn't know what they were doing. And then there were sentences like, in retrospect, a lot of these guys, meaning the scientists who were creating the spaceship, were morons. One time, one of the physics team leaders put a sweet potato wrapped in 2 layers of tin foil in the office microwave. And I think it just does not work. It's okay that people make mistakes and it's okay to make some things slip, but when you say that this spaceship that the entire humanity depended on was created by people who had no idea what they were doing and they were not actually real physicists, or they didn't know any of the basics of how whatever they're creating works, I just think it doesn't work and it reads a bit lazy. I'm sorry to say that. I feel so mean, but I really did not like the science aspect of it. And then, mind you, one of my favorite books of all time is Project Hail Mary, where Andy Weir convinced me that a preschool science teacher was sent in space to save the humanity. And I was convinced that it was actually true. However, here, I was not convinced whatsoever. So yeah, and then later on in the book, it just gets more and more fantasy-like, which is okay. It can be like a sci-fi fantasy mix. That's not a problem. It's the fact that this book is positioned as a sci-fi when I don't really think it is that. Also, I personally didn't like the main character of this book. I thought she was pretty selfish and a bit of an annoying character to follow. And then the romance, most of the romance is between her and the hologram. And I think this is a concept that is so difficult to execute well, and I don't think it really worked in the story. I really felt like it was more tell, not show kind of romance, and I personally didn't really feel that connection at all. It didn't get me emotional at all. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't wanna say any more bad things because I feel really bad for a review this negative. But I just think conceptually this book sounded so fun, and maybe that's why it's so frustrating that it really didn't work for me. But it's definitely not the type of sci-fi that I personally enjoy. And yeah, I didn't have fun with this one, unfortunately. And then lastly, I also picked up a nonfiction. I know, who is she? But I'm trying to get from my physical TBR. And I have a couple of nonfiction books about filmmaking on my shelf. So I decided to pick up Mise-en-scène, Film Style and Interpretation by John Gibbs. Sorry, I don't know how. I think Mise-en-scène is French. I don't really know how to pronounce it in French. I apologize for my terrible pronunciation. But yeah, this is essentially about mise-en-scène. So it is everything that you see in a shot of a movie. So the props, the actors, the lighting, also the composition, and the way all of those elements interact with each other and tell the story to the audience visually. I personally find the subject very interesting, as you know, I have this channel, and also because I'm just in general really interested in filmmaking and I really like this topic, so I really find it fun to read about it. I think the first half of this book was pretty fascinating because it talks about many interesting concepts and it gives so many examples. You have a lot of shots from different films in this book. Let me find an example for you. So as you can see here, you have many examples of the things that the author is talking about, and it is very interesting to discover how the language of film works, especially when you take sound out of it, even though by the end of the book, the author is making argument that essentially everything is interconnected in film, and it's not just about the image, it's also about the sound, the editing, the pacing, and so on. It's a very interesting exploration of mise-en-scène and how it works. If you're interested in filmmaking, I think that would be an interesting book to pick up. However, I do think towards the end of it, it does get pretty boring. It kind of just debating over and over the same things, and it's not really exploring mise-en-scène specifically anymore. So I enjoyed the first half of it more than I enjoyed the last half of it. I didn't give it a rating because it's a non-fiction and I feel like it's so hard to rate. For me, it was, I would say, like a 3-star book, but it really depends on if you're interested in the subject. If you have no interest in film, that you will find it incredibly boring, and that's perfectly fine. So yeah, I don't typically rate non-fiction because there's still like so much research that goes into it and so on, but it was fun, enjoyable. I don't regret reading this. I really liked some of the concepts and it was very interesting to discover how certain things work in film. So it was good, but I would only recommend it if you're really interested in the subject. So that is going to be all for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed. I hope that inspired you to pick up some of these books, specifically Abby Jimenez and The Fifth Season. I really hope you read them and enjoy them as much as I have. Please let me know how your July reading went. What have you been up to? What have you been reading? If you had a good reading month or not, or maybe what reading plans you have for August. I would love to hear from you. I love chatting to you in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you being here so much. I really hope you have a lovely day and I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye!